Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Actually, it should not be evening for anyone on here, I don't think. So good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to today's compliance webinar. Thank you so much for joining the call. My name is Adam Blasi. I'll be the moderator for today. And we have our awesome presenters on the call, Steve Thomas and Richard Beserra, our senior compliance technical specialists, who are going to take us through a discussion around the basics of data classification. But before we get started, as is tradition, we have to kick off with a dad joke, a nice dad joke. So, Richard, I have a question for you. How do you deal with the fear? How do you deal with the fear of speed bumps?
Ooh, I have no idea.
You slowly get over it. All right. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, so much for joining. If you have questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. We will address those as we get time throughout the presentation. Really appreciate you being here, and I'll hand it over to Steve and Richard.
Hey, thanks, everybody. Thank you for coming to our presentation. We are going to be going over the basics here. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the PowerPoint, actually, in contrast to our previous webinars. Most of this is intended to be a demonstration, and we wanted this to be a more simplified presentation of options. Most of our webinar series up to this point have been pretty deep in technical guidance. This series, The Basics of Compliance, is intended to take a larger zoomed out view and give you guidance for things that you can do today, that you don't need a staff, you don't need meetings to get you don't need a lot of expertise to start with. So let's get started, and maybe we'll highlight some capabilities you didn't know you had in Purview. So knowing your data is pretty much the first step in every kind of zero trust model. Whether it comes from NIST or Microsoft, it's nearly always at least one of the first things they tell you to do. And I've noticed in having conversations with government customers, it's the kind of suggestion that always seems well-meaning, but never really takes into account the reality of it. Sure, knowing your data sounds good and all, but I have 25,000 documents in a SharePoint library. What am I going to do? Go through that one by one? Am I going to pay some team, a partner to come in and tell me what I have? You don't have time or the money for it. And that is perfectly fair. Time and resources are always spread thin. And whenever you do hear people start telling you about the requirements of knowing your data, taxonomies and pillars and everything else, it gets intimidating. So starting this data protection journey is the most important step. And Microsoft tried to do a lot with Purview to make it either easy or to just handle the prep work for you altogether. So let's have a look at what that looks like on the next slide. So these are some of the tools Microsoft gives you to help you start classifying your data. And with the exception of exact data match, every single option you see on the screen here works right out of the box automatically. You don't need to go in and tell any of these options to start doing anything with your data. They start indexing it as you add it to the cloud. So you can start seeing where you have credit card numbers. If you have ICN numbers for Medicaid, if you have social security numbers or tax ID numbers, if people are emailing their passwords around, if people are storing documents that contain PII, PHI, FTI, any number of sensitive information types, all of these options on screen will give you a way to see that, to visibly identify where it's at and what you have. And as I said, except for exact data match, you don't need to get in there and turn these on. Start adding your data to the cloud, and we will start showing you where it's at, how many items you have with it, what they contain. And this works for Outlook. This works for Word documents, for PDFs, for PowerPoint presentations, even for Teams chat logs. So wherever your data is at in 365, you have ways right now to go see it without needing to stand up some additional solution. Now, once you know where your data is at, the next step is usually how do we protect it? And the first discussion that usually takes the form of is information protection, MIP, or commonly sensitivity labels. And again, as you start getting into the details of setting that up, it can sound complicated. If you've ever had those meetings or if you've ever talked to partners or anybody else about it, you've probably heard terms like taxonomy getting tossed around, label priority order, encryption, RMS permission management. The complexities can go really deep, and it sounds like a thing that you often don't have time for. Or if you have the time for it, it's going to be a benefit realized in 6 weeks after all the meetings are done and everything is tested. Oftentimes that's a delay you can't afford, and I don't blame you. So in the MIP portal, we start you off with simplified templates that you can turn on. And these are going to be kind of the quick and easy wins. And we'll tell you as you go what each of these templates will do for you. So you're not guessing. You don't have to dive into this and just really hope you made the right decision and just hope you're not going to break something. Starting with MIP and looking at just this overview page, you can see options down here to either choose what you want to set up, or you can tell it to set things up for you. And we'll tell you right here where your items are at and what type of data they contain. At each stage, we'll tell you what we're doing when you start clicking these buttons and checking these boxes. And so here we'll tell you exactly what the user impact is going to be. They're going to have an option in their apps, Outlook, Word, Excel, etc., that'll let them manually put these labels on things. You can even choose what label you want to put. If you want to have labeling suggestions for them at all, you can uncheck that box, or you can just skip this part of it altogether. Moving on to the next page, we will continue telling you, here's where your data is at. You have this many emails, for example, that have credit card numbers. They could also contain Medicaid information. You can use this for HIPAA compliance. And if you want to set up the auto labeling, we tell you right here. We'll set up an auto labeling policy for you, and we will explicitly put it in simulation mode. That way you don't accidentally risk locking anybody out of their data. Nobody gets disrupted by suddenly seeing new messages all over their documents that weren't there yesterday. Once the simulation mode is run, then you can go in and you can decide what you want to turn on, if it's accurate or if it needs to be tuned a little bit. But all of that is left in your control. And at every stage, we're trying to give you guidance so that you understand what you're doing, but we're also trying to make it simple so that you don't have to have a bunch of meetings with stakeholders before you can implement these measures. This is us, and this is your option to make starting as feasible as possible. On a small staff, a small budget, and a tight deadline, you can still get your protection measures started, and that alone will begin guaranteeing your data against exfiltration, at least to some degree. I see a question in chat. Curtis, yeah, what do you got? I'm sorry, Eric, yeah.
Okay. Really quickly, regarding auto labeling, what is the probability of false positives or miss classification? Because I mean, I've done this on a large scale, and doing auto labeling was a disaster because it was mislabeling particular data sets. How do we handle that type of conflict?
So that's going to be handled in the simulation mode first, because you're right, false positives can happen, especially if it's false negatives. Those are even worse. The simulation mode is what will tell you what the results would be before you actually start putting labels on anything. And if you need to tune that probability, if it's too restrictive or it's not broad enough, you can adjust the thresholds for the sensitive information types that you're using in your simulation. You can add new ones. You can add custom SITs. So all of these other options we looked at back here on this slide can be used with auto labeling rules. And you can adjust how strict or how loose you need each one to be. So the probability isn't going to be perfect right away with auto labeling. That's why we put this in simulation mode first. but you have ways to tune it and rerun that simulation until it's accurate enough, or at least accurate as you need, and then you can deploy it. Does that answer your question?
Gotcha. Sounds good. Yep. As long as there's a mechanism. I like the
Yep.
simulation.
Yep, and that's what we put it in for you by default, because you're right, just running it automatically right out the gate, it has created problems before. I don't recommend customers do it either. All right, so moving on to the next slide. Those are just kind of the basics for what you can do right out of the box, just the recommendations to get things stood up. Once you're ready to start making more deliberate decisions, sensitivity labels can extend to a lot more coverage. When you're ready to start really sculpting your MIP solution and you're ready to say, okay, let's use them here and here, see what else we can do. These are some of the things sensitivity labels can interact with in information protection and in Office. You can control access to SharePoint sites. You can prevent certain activities in your team's meetings. Previously, we were able to put sensitivity labels just on teams themselves, and that controlled membership. Now you can actually control the activity within a meeting. So if you want to prevent somebody from copy pasting what people type in it, your labels can do that. Excuse me. If your documents or your emails leave the environment and they're encrypted by our labels, they're going to stay encrypted. Even if they make it to some Linux server in Sri Lanka somewhere, that protection stays with them. Scanned documents. I'm looking at a question here in chat. Does data classification support scanned of a PDF? Yes. So we can extract the data from a PDF, that text, and depending on what it contains, whatever you're looking for, we can tell you that that W-4 contains tax ID numbers, or it contains full names, anything like that. For other scanned images, we actually have a feature called OCR as well that can be used in DLP to identify the raw images rather than PDF conversions of a document. So we have ways to cover a lot of that as well. So yes, a scanned PDF of a W-4 can be indexed and can be discovered. All right. So assuming you get your sensitivity label set up, the next kind of easy win comes from DLP, or data loss prevention. And this is another one that government customers tend to be very wary about, because this directly impacts communication. And if you turn this on and it's not what you need, you can block emails, you can accidentally lock people out of talking over Teams and doing their business. So it's understandable government customers really want to be reticent about using this. So we give you ways to do this carefully out of the box as well. So we have out of the box compliance templates, like a HIPAA template, FTI or privacy laws, things like that, that can help protect certain types of data. And that can be applied to multiple locations pretty simply. It's a toggle button, and you can put them on emails or in different SharePoint sites. And the setup for this is similar to the setup for what we just saw with sensitivity labels. If you don't have your taxonomy laid out yet, and you haven't had a bunch of meetings with a bunch of stakeholders, and you haven't had 30 people that have all signed off on your plan yet, that's okay. You have ways to get something started out of the box with these recommended templates. And again, just like with the labels, we will be as transparent as possible at every stage. And we tell you, here's your data, here's what we recommend you do, and here's what'll happen when you click this button. So if you wanted to set up the default DLP policies according to these recommendations, we will tell you, here's what's going to happen. Here's the data we're going to look at. And at each stage, you can put these into test mode, or you can apply them. Back up here to this one here. So once these policies are created, and we'll see this in the demo, you can put these into test mode, or you can activate them right away. The test mode will still give you the reporting that you need, similar to the way the auto labeling was. And it'll tell you, here's what we would have blocked had this been active. And that way you can go through and tune the rules to make them more or less restrictive as needed. Now, moving off of DLP, Insider Risk Management has a similar feature that you can set up and is transparent to your employees. And that's the data analytics section. So if you have access to insider risk management, if it's a tool in your portal, I highly recommend you turn this on today. The data analytics is completely harmless. You're not going to block anybody. Nobody's going to get alerts. Nobody's going to get emails saying you're looking at their data. And it's not going to lock out anybody's account. What it will do is give you information like this. It'll take 48 hours to run through your environment and look at all the activity for the past 90 days for all of your employees. And at the end of that 48-hour period, it'll tell you, hey, here's what some of your potential leak activities are. Here's what we recommend you set up in your insider risk management tool. But you don't have to. You can use this information to go sculpt your retention policies, to go set up a DLP policy that you may not have thought you needed. You can use this information to set up IRM and make it transparent and just hand it over to your SOC team if you need, or for any other number of things you need. You can produce a report for leadership with this. Either way, no matter what you do with it, it's invisible to your employees. There's no technical expertise required. You can start this and confidently trust that you're not disrupting anybody's business, but you are going to get that visibility into your environment that you need in order to start making security decisions. Now, I always like to relate all of this information whenever I'm talking about it to real-world use cases. So, why do we focus so much on this stuff? Because it can seem pretty dry at the time, complying with CJIS, complying with HIPAA. And it's important to remember the stakes of data mishandling, because sometimes it is just a fine and some paperwork. It's things that are uncomfortable, but we can live with it. And then sometimes it leads to headlines like these. So a hospital might get locked out of patient records in the middle of some disaster, lost credentials to some forgotten laptop in a power substation, might give an attacker a way to get in and shut that station down a month from now during a heavy snowstorm. Cyber criminals want this data. They want this PII, this PHI. They want these credentials because that's how they get into these systems. And that's where they can make the most money with the least effort. And we've been seeing this on the rise for the past 5 years. Rises in ransomware, the democratization of attack tools that make it easier to start stealing data and using them to lock people out, to hold systems hostage. And we know the critical infrastructure sectors they're targeting, at least in New York, are these three right here: healthcare, financial services, and any kind of government or commercial facilities. And this has been consistent with the trend we've been seeing all across the country. So when we talk about protecting your data, we are trying to help you treat the disease, not the symptom. We'd rather give you the tools to prevent something like this from happening in the first place, rather than giving you the tools to deal with it once it happens. Prevention is always going to be better than remediation. And so that's why there's so much focus on this. Now we have this slide deck available as a PDF. We'll upload it to the channel at the end of this meeting. But at the end of this slide deck, there are resources here if you do want to read more. If you want to see more about how to get started with discovering your data, or if you want to learn about some of the additional tools that are in Purview that you may not be using today, all of these links will take you to guidance for that. But that's enough talking from me. I do want to turn this over to Steve now, because I do want you to see these tools in action and not just be looking at a dry PowerPoint. Steve, are you ready on your end?
I am, Richard. Can everyone hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Awesome. So let's dive right in. And I'm going to ask my fellow moderators and compliance Avengers, as we call ourselves, if they could keep their eye on the chat and answer any questions that come through. As Richard said, we want to let you see this kind of in a live environment, and so we're going to take a trip over to a company called Gladiator Industries. Gladiator Industries has had some data security, protection, governance, compliance issues over the last couple of years, and they're trying to leverage Microsoft Purview to get in front of this problem that they've had, getting in front of their unstructured data. And so what you see here is you see that we're looking now within the Microsoft Purview console at the data classification overview blade. And this is something that you can take advantage of before you actually do anything proactively. As soon as you activate your Purview trial or Purview in your tenant, within a couple of days, you're going to get a lot of insight into what's going on in your Microsoft 365 estate. And what's going to happen is we're going to crawl all your data. Again, by we mean the managed folder agents, no humans, and actually are going to kind of show you what we are seeing within your estate. We're going to look at our inbox classifiers and actually compare that with your data estate. And we're going to look at our inbox sensitive information types. And we're going to give you all of this information from a high level view of, as you can see here for the Gladiator Industries company, there's a lot of source code. There's a lot of financial documents. There's a lot of intellectual property. There's a lot of license agreements. And it makes sense because this is pretty much a software company. And this is a software company that's going to be that's going to be creating software and services for a variety of commercial, government, and foreign entities. So obviously regulatory compliance is going to be helpful and necessary. And obviously that's going to involve, proper data security and data protection. Likewise, we can see here that there's a lot of sensitive information that's actually being detected. Full names, physical addresses, medical terms and conditions, diseases, because it just so happens that one of the spaces that Gladiator Industries works in with regards to software is the healthcare space. So much sensitive data here. And how do we get in front of it? Well, the nice thing about the overview blade is as you're actually creating, publishing, and starting to, implement labeling and labeling policies, you can then come back and start seeing what's been happening here, the labeling activity by users, which sensitivity labels are being applied to content. While we're not going to get into, retention and records management, you can also see here retention labels that are being applied to content, and you get all your activities happening here. We see we have, well, this is a little bit of a concern here. We've got some stuff that we might want to involve insider risk in later, so I'm going to take a note of that. We've started implementing some DLP policies, both active and simulated. And we've also got some auto label simulation going on here as we are in the process of testing a lot of these policies. And we have great visibility here in the data classification overview blade, but we can also take this a little bit further when we start diving into Content Explorer. Content Explorer is going to let us look at this information in a more granular fashion. As you can see here, it's detected a lot of sensitive information types, and this sensitive information types is across the Exchange, OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams estates. And as we need to, if we want to further dive in and further investigate, we can actually go further into the content and actually get even more granular visibility, not just knowing how much of this is in SharePoint, but actually looking at this based upon the sites. And of course, obviously, in some cases, it's going to make sense that full names are going to be very prevalent in like HR sites, for example. But as you can see, we've got a lot of sites here, and some contain more information than others. Some is probably an appropriate, but we can actually, look at this and kind of see where we need to start acting the most in terms of, possibly potentially implementing DLP policies and auto labeling policies further on down the road. Likewise, as Richard talked about earlier, when you start getting into testing policies and policy simulations, you can come back to the Activity Explorer and you can actually start looking at what's happening here. For And again, there we go. There's that file created on removable media. I've got a lot of that happening here. All right, so we've got, as you can see here, some auto label simulations that are occurring. We've got some DLP rule matches here. We've got, of course, the file created on removable media. This is, as you can see, it can be very noisy. So you don't necessarily want to use this as kind of an alert or audit trail. This is more for you to kind of see and gauge what's going to happen as a result of some of these policies, or in essence to see what noise is being created if you're worried about too much noise. If you are worried about false positives, you can look at where some of the auto labeling simulation is occurring, and again get in front of that as well. So again, data classification, great for visibility, great for insights. But now let's talk a little bit more about the classifiers themselves. And so we're going to click over here in the classifiers blade. And we've got 3 different types of classifiers here. I'm going to start first with kind of just, I don't want to rehash what Richard said completely, but I want to start actually with sensitive information types. So I'm going to click over here on sensitive information types. Now, when we're talking about SITs, or sensitive information types, we're talking about sensitive entities that are a component within a document, like a banking routing number, or a full name, or a tax ID number, or social security number, or a credit card number. And I have to tell you, in many cases, most of what most companies or organizations need, especially when it comes to being compliant with regulations related to PII or Sarbanes-Oxley or HIPAA, we have all this stuff in box ready for you. And it also has the intelligence behind it. And this intelligence is constantly being retrained and refined to ensure that we match up these SITs correctly, and we eliminate false positives when correctly. And as you can see, even though this is a U.S. state and local government webinar series, this is obviously a global piece of software or global service. So we're going to have a lot of these SITs, not just for U.S., but for other nations all across the globe as well. And the SITs can be leveraged either out of the box, or there might be some reason why you would want to create a custom sensitive information type, or to create a fingerprint-based SIT. And when you go to create a sensitive information type or a custom SIT, and I'm just going to call this and click the necessary things to get me to the next page. And now I have to define the patterns for this sensitive information type. Now, when I go to create a pattern, the great thing about this, and one of the reasons why, even though most people don't need to do this, it explains the intelligence behind Purview's SIT format itself. And the aspect that you have to be aware of when you're creating a SIT, or when you are trying to understand a SIT, is obviously there's a primary pattern. And the primary pattern is going to be things like employee ID numbers, project numbers. This is typically identified sometimes statically, but also by a regular expression, but it can also be a list of keywords. But here's the thing here. You also need what we have, supporting evidence, or additional, additional checks and additional evidence, as we call it. Because suppose you're looking for a 9-digit employee ID number. Well, not all 9-digit numbers are employee ID numbers. So you can look for more text with keywords like employee or badge or ID, or other text patterns that might be included based off other regular expressions. This supporting evidence, you might also hear it referred to as corroborative evidence, will increase the likelihood that this 9-digit number is really an employee ID number, and it lowers the chances for false positive. I explained to folks a lot of times that they want to create a sit, they want to be very careful and make sure that they don't have to, because creating a sit can be, especially if it's a numerical sit, for example, can be tough because that's where a lot of false positives come from. I'll use one of our inbox examples, credit card numbers. We have so much additional evidence for that because it's not just the 16-digit number. It's not just the fact that it might be in units of 4 and 4 units of 4 in the case of a credit card number. But we also have intelligence behind the scenes of knowing all the 4-character prefixes and that they're associated with specific banks or associated with MasterCard or Visa. And so what makes the SIT refined and reduces false positives is the not just a pattern, but things like additional evidence, and then of course character proximity. Whereas you see here, we have the option to control that. The closer the primary pattern and the supporting evidence are to each other, the more likely the detected content is going to be what you're looking for. But you could specify the character distance between the primary pattern and the supporting evidence. That is what we think of as the proximity window. And again, this is another factor to reduce false positives and increases the accuracy of finding actual sensitive information to protect. And then, of course, we have the confidence level. The more supporting evidence you have, the higher the likelihood that a match contains the sensitive information type you're looking for. You can assign higher levels of confidence for matches that are detected by using more evidence. However, though, the trade-off there is that's going to raise the amount of false positives. And so you might think that I'm leading somewhere, and in fact I am. But before I move further, I just want to kind of walk you through how how we would detect a social security number, for example, because that's something we all understand. Now, our built-in SIT for social security number actually uses 4 different functions to search for different regular expressions. And when a regular expression is matched and is within 300 characters of a keyword from the keyword social security list that we have internally, it's going to add more evidence by proximity. And the confidence level will then determine the possible false positive rates within the found matches with more evidence. So, again, that is the process of creating a custom SIT. I want to now back up a little bit, and I'm going to cancel out of this and talk about some other matches that you might want to, possibly you consider. You could actually create a fingerprint-based SIT. And a fingerprint SIT is going to be based on the fingerprint of a file. So you would upload the file for which you would like to create a fingerprint. And that's what I want to talk about with things like fingerprint SITs. And then we also have something called exact data match based classification as well. And with what we're doing there, I'm going to cancel out of here real quick, is you're actually going to create an EDM classifier by either doing one of 2 things. We recommend first that you upload a file containing the sample data. It's going to be faster. It's going to help you identify errors, or you can manually define your data structure, and you would have to name the fields and choose which sensitive information types would best match them. Now, again, what is exact data match based classification? Well, you're going to be creating behind the scenes databases with custom SITs that refer to exact values. This database can be refreshed daily, and it can grow as large as you need it to grow. And when large quantities of sensitive information need to be matched daily, for example, all the stored personal information of employees of an organization, well, EDM-based classification is going to enable you to find those exact data matches. For example, if the first and family name and the date of birth of a certain employee is sent a message, EDM classification can match this information from this database of sensitive information. Now, do I recommend this? Well, it depends. It's best for organizations that don't necessarily want to rely on a lot of our inbox sits, and they need to store large amounts of personal information. Hospitals can benefit from EDM-based classification to make sure no personal information of patients are being shared. But I got to tell you, as Richard said, when you start moving into this area, this is where it's going to get really, really complicated. And so while I'm showing you this, I'm not necessarily recommending you go this route if you're just getting started, because as Richard said earlier, and I'm going to show you, we have some easier templates, or what I call easy buttons, for like a hospital or organization to protect, for example, anything that would fall under HIPAA or HITRUST. But I did want to point it out here. And then finally, I wanted to talk about trainable classifiers. And if you have proprietary information and you're looking at this from a holistic perspective, for example, you might be a food production company that has dozens or even hundreds of secret recipes. You might have an organization where you have employee document files that all follow a similar format. And it's just really complicated to go through the EDM, and it's really complicated to go through and create, a whole bunch of custom sits. But you still have to solve the chicken and egg scenario. And what I mean by the chicken and egg scenario is, how does Microsoft know what to protect when it comes to our proprietary information, if we're the only ones who know what this looks like? If we're the only ones who can identify this because it is proprietary, then how does Microsoft get in front of that? Well, that's when you start looking at letting us do the work through our back-end AI and machine learning. And that's where trainable classifiers are involved here. Now, you saw trainable classifiers earlier because we were taking a whole bunch of our inbox trainable classifiers, and we were actually we were actually comparing them with this existing data in your estate. And these are classifiers that are constantly being trained and retrained, and you can keep track of that. As you can see, the last modification dates for all of these are extremely recent as well. And this is great for not only data classification, but extending into so many other facets of Microsoft Purview. But what I want to talk about right now is another possibility that you have if you want to leverage the trainable classifiers and perhaps create your own. Because as I said earlier, we have to solve the chicken and egg scenario here. So let's say I want to resolve a custom face statement that I have within my own company that uses our own proprietary information. Well, I can do that. What you would do is when you go to create that, it's going to ask you to seed the content. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be training our AI with a whole bunch of positive examples of that. And what I usually tell customers is to dedicate an entire SharePoint site to your seed content, your AI training here, as I've done here as well. And because we're short on time, I'm just going to walk you through some of these things, and I'm going to skip over to some other components here. But as you can see, I can go here, I can add the site, and I'm going to just simply add the site here. I will AI training. I'm going to click add. I'm going to select the folder. Base statements. I'm going to click next. And now I'm going to create the classifier. And while you're doing this, you want to have another SharePoint site that's dedicated to AI testing. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to have a folder that has different examples of positive and negative matches for this classifier. So you can go in and you can see the results of the testing here. So as you can see, I've created the phase statements, and the phase statements are in progress because it's going to take a few hours for it to actually learn the information and implement the machine learning. And then once it's done with that, you can proceed to start testing the data. And so you would supply a folder to test against, and then once you do that, it's going to start reviewing the items to and determining which ones it thinks are matches and which ones it thinks aren't a match. And you're going to have an accuracy score here. And as you can see, I've been working with this CCal for quite a while now, and it's not quite where I want it to be, but I'm able to continuously go in here, and I'm able to look at what's a match and what's not a match. And this one here is definitely not a calendar. This looks like a, what is this? It's going to pop up here. Oh, this is a Major League Baseball box score. So that's definitely not a match. So I'm going to agree here. And as I step through this, I'm going to be gradually improving, hopefully, the accuracy score to where it gets to a point where then soon I'm able to publish the classifier. And once the classifier is published, it's going to show up here with all the rest of the inboxed classifiers, and I can begin to go about creating labels as need be. Okay, so we've gone through the classifiers. Now let's talk about leveraging them for creating sensitivity labels. Now, labels are like our classifiers. We have the capability of publishing some out-of-the-box labels, which fall into 3 basic categories. And it's great because when you create a label, you can create a label and you can associate many characteristics with that label, but it's not until you publish that label that label is then able to be leveraged. Now, in the case of a sensitivity label, you're going to go in here and you're going to step through the process of creating a label. And I'm going to just quickly go through the description there. And then you're going to define the scope for the label. Again, that could be applied directly to items. They can be, which when we're talking about items, we're talking about entities like files, emails, meetings, and then of course containers, things like SharePoint sites and Teams and Power BI items. And then if you want to extend the label over into your Azure Cloud Estate, schematized data assets in Data Map and Data Catalog as well. And so you can control the scope, and then you can click next, and then you can decide if you want to, if once something has been labeled, what kind of protection settings are going to be put in place. You can apply or remove encryption, apply content marking, or both. I don't have the Teams meeting capability in this particular tenant because your org needs a Teams premium license. But if your org does have a Teams premium license, you can then protect team meetings and chats. And so in this case, I'm going to select both of these, and then I'm going to click next. And then of course you can remove encryption if the file or email or calendar event is encrypted. You can also turn on encryption settings. You can also take advantage of turning on co-authoring Office desktop apps, so multiple users can simultaneously work on documents that are labeled and encrypted as long as they have access. You can assign permissions now or let users decide. And you can also, user access to content can expire never, or on a specific date, or on a number of days after the label is applied. You can allow or not allow offline access or restrict for a number of days. All of this stuff. And by the way, offline access meaning they are unable to reach the IRM service that would actually controls the authorization to this particular label. And then, of course, scope permissions to users and groups. Now, when you do this, again, it's, as Richard said, before you start publishing labels, you really want to sit down and you want to decide what degrees of protection and labeling do you want to put in place. And more importantly, you don't want to have more than 4 or 5 labels. Most everyone I talk to agrees, because what you're going to be publishing here is going to be pervasive all through the Microsoft 365 app ecosystem, as well as any other app that with any plugins that support the Purview sensitivity label ecosystem. So, you want to be able to have something that's going to be clean and visible, and most importantly, is not going to throw off users. For example, it's going to show whether you're manually labeling. We'll talk briefly about auto labeling in a second here. But if you notice here, I've kind of put the sub-label capability here where I've got general, I've got confidential, and then I've got a special one here called information currently falling under tinted projects, because the Gladiator Industry Software Company often has secrets within the organization where only certain people are cleared for certain projects, especially if these software projects are related to specific contracts or government contracts, because many of these users working on this stuff might be dealing with software that might interface with sensitive information, and they might need to be cleared for a specific reason. Now, let's talk about auto labeling. Auto labeling is going to be one of those things where, as Richard said, you're going to want to simulate a lot of this first. Now, when we start debating about auto labeling, we're talking about the fact that we're acknowledging that we don't necessarily trust humans to do the right thing. And that's something your organization is going to have to ask itself first. Do we trust our users to do the right thing intentionally, whether it's intentional or whether it's accidental? Most of the time, when things aren't protected properly, it's accidental. You might want to consider other ways as well. You might want to consider creating a label policy, for example, and this label policy could not necessarily automatically label, but could do what we have in this particular example here, where I'm going to send a resume I just received from a gentleman who's applying named Quentin Bushrod, and I'm going to send it to one of our HR reps, Madison Avenue. So I'm going to upload Quentin's resume. And I'm going to click send. And I like doing this with my policies. Your organization, I require a sensitivity label, but I'm going to put the onus on the user to apply whatever sensitivity label they have. So it's kind of it's kind of a compromise policy where I acknowledging that I don't trust the users to always do the right thing. So I'm nudging them along a little bit. And I could be an organization that tried policy tips, but I found that policy tips are being ignored. So now I'm taking it to the next level. And so because this is confidential information, I'm going to put this to all employees, unrestricted, and then send it. And now it's got a label assigned to it. And I'll just put into sensitive information that the label now has been applied. And we're good to go. Now, if you do want to consider an auto labeling policy, again, as Richard pointed out, you have two approaches that you can do this with. You have some planning with this particular example here that you might want to do in advance. For example, if I wanted to, if I wanted to, instead of creating a label from scratch, I wanted to create a label that used under the medical and health category, the HIPAA template, then I probably would like to have a label created in advance that's labeled HIPAA. Just so what happens there is once the labeling happens and the labeling occurs, the users and everyone involved can understand the label that was applied. Also, when you're doing this in simulation mode, it helps you to gauge whether or not the right label was applied appropriately here. But what's happening here is instead of you creating a custom labeling policy from scratch where you're supplying all the SITs, the trainable classifiers, you're actually going to use one of these templates, or as I like to call, easy buttons, and you're going to just simply select that. And as you see over here, it's going to tell you all the information that we're protecting. And so any document, and again, any document that contains this information is going to match this label policy, and it's going to have the label and everything that comes with the label slapped on it, which is why you want to do this stuff in simulation mode first, especially if you're using the templates of the easy buttons. And again, I'll just step you through, and you kind of saw this in the slide deck, but I want to just kind of reiterate here that with the labels, you can then, of course, go in and if you want to control the scope of locations, you can. By default, it's going to be all users and groups in Exchange, all SharePoint sites, all OneDrive accounts. So you might want to go in and scope that out just a little bit more. And then, of course, because we set up a template, the common rules are already defined. But again, you can also, if you need to, assign advanced rules if you want. Of course, I've already got one that exists here, and go in and customize the information as well. Now, if going back to what we demonstrated earlier, I'm going to cancel here. If you were leveraging a trainable classifier, then you were probably, and you wanted the trainable classifier to have a label associated with it that's also going to be automatically applied to the documents that match that, you're going to want to actually create an auto labeling policy from scratch. So you're going to actually select custom. Oops. And then you would define the rule. And of course, this rule would be defined up here, and you would add the condition. And then, of course, you would, select whether it's a SIT or a trainable classifier, and then you would go in and select your trainable classifier that you created earlier. Okay, being mindful of time here, Richard also mentioned DLP. DLP is something that you could actually start from day one, because DLP is going to be focused more on behavior, more so than information protection. Well, let me rephrase that. Not necessarily direct information protection, but behaviors around this protected information, if that makes sense. Because with DLP, what you can do is without necessarily applying permanent labels, you can create policies that will provide just-in-time in-process classification of data and then act upon that if the user is trying to, for example, exfiltrate that data either by copying it to USB or copying it to an unauthorized web application, uploading it through RDP. And again, DLP has the very same templates and easy buttons that we mentioned and saw when we were talking about auto labeling. And again, for example, we'll go back to that same HIPAA example here, where in this particular case, we're going to look at this information here. But when we detect this information, instead of actually slapping a label on it automatically, it's going to match with this policy and act based upon how the policy has been configured. And what's great about this DLP policy is if you have E5 or G5, you can extend this policy beyond Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive. And notice here, you can take this into Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, chats, and channel messages, on-premise repositories like file shares. Of course, that requires an additional agent. And then, of course, endpoint devices. Oh, I love this. When you hear us talking about endpoint DLP, we're talking about the E5 data loss prevention solution, because for Windows devices, if you've got Windows 10 or Windows 11 in a in-service supported version, it's automatically included and it just needs to be activated or onboarded. And this also works with Mac OS as well. Of course, with Mac OS, it is going to require the addition of a new agent to deploy to those machines. But once you select that, and of course, right now, on-premise repositories aren't supported for enhanced DLP templates. You're going to need to create a custom policy for that. And then, of course, your policy settings, you can review the customized settings from the template, or you can customize the advanced DLP rules yourself. And then, of course, you can then control what happens when there's a DLP policy match. You can show policy tips to users, send them an email notification. You can even customize the tip in email. You can also send the alert, customize the alert configuration, even tune down the alert noise. And then, of course, you can customize your access and override settings, including auditing or restricting activities on the device. Notice that's not checked by default. Some people leave that unchecked while they create the policy, and then once they're sure they want to start this, they can actually go through and turn this on a little bit. And as you can see, you can even control whether you want to audit only, which is what Richard and I both recommend you do that first. And then you can go back into the Activity Explorer we showed you earlier and see what's going on and see how this is behaving. And
quick question: does does that also apply to, like, so should say we have a recording in Teams?
I'm sorry.
Does like the DLP policies apply to Teams recordings or just Teams messages themselves on the workstation?
Teams chats and recordings. Richard, I'm not entirely sure. Do we have DLP support for recordings yet?
For recordings, we have them when they include the transcript.
Transcripts, yeah.
Yeah, but not the recordings themselves. So transcription has to be enabled, and then the recording will be associated with the transcript, and the transcript is what the DLP will be applied to.
Cool. And do you know if when on the roadmap the recordings themselves might be, or is that down the road?
Best I can say is down the road. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what it looks like on the schedule.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Eric, did you have a question as well that you wanted to ask real quick?
Yeah, really quickly. I saw that you had devices there. Is that referencing to anything like the unified scanner that that has to be deployed to workstations, or is that out of the picture now with the
No,
unified scanner?
for endpoint DLP for Windows devices, we share a common platform out of box with Defender. So you would just need to send a script, or you can use Intune or Config Manager or even a third-party MDM to just activate the dormant sense and agent service that's already on Windows 10 and Windows 11.
Okay, but what if we don't use Windows Defender for endpoint? How do we, what's that sensory to deploy it? Is there an agent that we have to deploy in order to make unified scanning work? Because
you
like,
would
for example, we use CrowdStrike.
Okay, so endpoint DLP can run alongside CrowdStrike. You would just MDE would be set up in passive mode, and you would still have to push down an onboarding script to the endpoint devices. But you would just be leveraging the DLP portion of the Sense client.
Gotcha. Thanks.
All right. I know we're over. I just want to show one more thing, and that is if you are also looking for some prescriptive guidance, don't forget about the deployment guides in or the admin guides over in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, because under Secure Score, there is something called the Microsoft Purview Information Protection Setup Guide. And this is a great way for you to kind of take some of the best practices that have been tested and implemented time and time again from our fast track team, and actually start going through, and this will actually walk you through getting everything set up with regards to data classification, labeling, and everything that would fall under Purview Information Protection, including making sure your roles and licenses are set up, making sure you've got the advanced classifiers to eliminate false positives, and then the labeling and the DLP policies. All of that is available here through the admin guides, and it will walk you through everything step by step. And I've gone over a little bit. I appreciate everyone hanging with me, and I will go ahead and stop for now. And as Richard said, links to all of this stuff is coming in the PDF. And I appreciate everyone's time. I'm really excited to have had this opportunity. I know a lot of folks are still struggling to get around data classification, and I hope this was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Steve. Thank you, Richard, and the rest of the Compliance Avengers for helping address these questions in chat. And of course, thank you all so much for sticking with us. We can't wait to see you on future webinars and looking forward to talking to you soon. Have a great rest of your day.